Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler. You probably noticed that the setting is different now and my frame rate is a little bit better. Finally, it's taken a while to do that. Turns out that the library that I've been recording in front of for quite a while was just getting way too big. You may recall that in that library you had all kinds of books over here. There's actually 4 book towers and then one bookshelf about this size filled with Star Wars books, and then another one of these next to it over off to this side that had all the video stuff on it. And quite frankly, that still wasn't enough. The books were overflowing, they were piling up on the bottom, it was getting kind of ugly. And there just wasn't any other room in that particular room in my apartment in order to expand that library at all. So it finally came down to saying, you know what, something's got to give. So I took all the home video stuff off of that shelf, that became another bookshelf, and then I went and bought yet another one of these things and moved it to a different room. So now this is the room that has my comic boxes in it off to one side within easy reach, and the home video library gets its own special little place here with the big shelf and the one smaller home video shelf there. If you're keen-eyed, you'll find that the organization is also different here. The way I've got it set up now is by format. So you have Blu-rays, then DVDs, VHS, Betamax, and then you get into 8mm, then the spin-off series, Droids, Ewoks, Ewok Telemovies, Clone Wars Micro Series, Clone Wars, down to Rebels, the PVD stuff, old bootleg of the holiday special we won't look at because it is a bootleg, because there is no official release. And then the bottom shelf that you can't see from the perspective here has the CEDs and Laserdiscs, a big old chunk of Laserdiscs. And that is where we're going for the next few episodes here. I had started out my collection thinking I wasn't really going to delve into Laserdisc all that much. But now that I've finished up VHS and Betamax and DVD and Blu-ray and all these other formats that I was going for first, I started to delve more deeply into the Laserdisc because it's an interesting sort of side aspect of mainstream Star Wars home video collecting, because many people, both Star Wars fans and otherwise, tended to gravitate toward VHS and Betamax during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And Laserdisc, while honestly a better format for most things, was never something that really caught on as much in the US as it did in other parts of the world, particularly in Japan. So there are quite a few important Star Wars home video releases on Laserdisc that haven't been covered here on the show just yet. We've really covered one and made a couple of side notes about some others. Beyond that, really haven't delved into it because these are mostly recent acquisitions for me. So we have here basically a 3-episode series, so to speak, where we're going to be taking a look at different chunks of the Star Wars Laserdisc library. This time, we take a look at the Star Wars Laserdiscs from 1982 through 1984, which in this case is 3 different releases. So let's rewind back to 1982. Remember that Star Wars on home video really kicks off in a big way in 1982. Prior to that, you had 8mm or Super 8 reels of selected scenes from A New Hope, but that was it. And then you had that same type of thing happen for Empire Strikes Back. But that was it. No full releases unless you got your hands on the 16mm prints that really weren't meant to be in private hands. They were for libraries, prisons, and places like that. The real first big full versions of any Star Wars films on home video came in 1982. We have looked at the 1982 video rental library version of A New Hope on VHS. We saw that there was a corresponding release for that on Betamax. There was no rental version for the video rental library, to my knowledge, on Laserdisc or on CED. It is those 4 big formats that are the heart of the home video scene back in the early 1980s in the US. Then later in 1982, we got the first home video releases meant to be purchased. Remember, those rentals were sometimes purchased against policy as lifetime rentals, but they weren't actually meant to be that. Our first home video releases on VHS and Betamax to correspond here. This is our VHS one we've looked at previously. And then we had the Betamax version, looking very similar here. These are those drawer case ones that we've looked at previously. And those did have a corresponding release on CED that we've looked at, which is this one here. The defining factor of how you know that the one from 82 is the very first one again is 20th Century Fox Video. We saw that with the A New Hope CED in a variant episode here. Same thing with Betamax. Same thing with VHS. And this is where Laserdisc starts to come in. Whereas there was not a rental version of it, the very first Star Wars Laserdisc was indeed in 1982 and did indeed have that 20th Century Fox logo on it. This is that release. The very first Star Wars Laserdisc in the US of any kind, dated 1982. You'll find the cover is very similar to those on the other formats. 20th Century Fox Video up here, and down here, we'll come back to this other stuff here in just a second. The back, the information, very similar to what we saw on those other releases in this case. 20th Century Fox Video logo down at the bottom. Now this release, if you look inside, got one of those little protective covers, and then you've got the disc itself. Again, large discs, about LP size or larger, and they'll tell you what they are on the center here. Kind of hard to see with all the reflection coming back at you, but 20th Century Fox Video, we have Extended Play, Star Wars, etc., etc. Product number 1130-80. But you notice here, one film, one disc, two sides. Now if you look at the front, it says Laser Video Disc, in other words, Laserdisc, right? And down here, Stereo Extended Play. It's going to be this corner that is our primary means of telling different editions apart over the years. But Stereo Extended Play, when I say extended play, that mean like it's extra long or something? It's got extra scenes? No, doesn't mean anything like that. Extended play is in this case mentioned as opposed to standard play. We'll look at what that means in a little more detail as we get a little bit forward in this, as we look at our next episode on the Laserdisc. The short version of it is to say that an extended play disc is also known as a CLV disc. And a CLV disc has 1 hour worth of material on either side. So in this case, you've got one film with half on one side, half on the other. Again, we'll go into more detail next time. But you might say, well, wait a second. Let me go back and look at one of our other releases here. Yeah, A New Hope is supposed to be 121 minutes long. That's a minute more than being able to say an hour on one side, an hour on the other side. But let's look at the runtime listed for the Laserdisc down here. Color, running time, 118 minutes. There's a 3-minute difference between the length on VHS and on Betamax versus the Laserdisc. Okay, let's check out the CED. Let's see what the CED says. Surely that's, going to be the same, right? 118 minutes again. This is something that I mentioned back when we were talking about the CEDs. In order to fit the time restrictions of this particular format, Laserdisc and also on CED, you have to compress the time of some movies. So what they did essentially was, instead of cutting out scenes, you would have frames cut here and there. So that essentially what you've got is a film that's the same content essentially, but compressed down by taking out a few frames here and there, so that eventually it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks by about, depending on what movie it is, you're looking at anything between about 2% and about 5%. So the runtime is a little bit shorter, but it's not really noticeable until you really try to do a side-by-side comparison of that film with another version of the same thing, say on VHS, Betamax, or some other format that isn't time compressed. So it's the same movie, very, very slightly sped up. So what you have here essentially is the best looking version of its time of Star Wars on home video. Laserdisc is an analog format. It's analog audio in this case, analog video. It is not digital, even though it kind of looks like it because it looks like it's just a giant CD. It's an analog format, but it still is able to provide a better number of TV lines or scan lines. Not quite double, but getting there as far as the number of lines it can produce on a television here, to create a more crisp picture than VHS, Betamax, or CED could offer. And as you get towards 1983, what is it that we saw on those other formats, late 82 into 83? Well, the CEDs went from 20th Century Fox to CBS Fox. And we looked at that in our episode on the CED variants. We saw the VHS ones go from 20th Century Fox to a pretty much identical release with CBS Fox. Same thing with Betamax. 20th Century Fox to CBS Fox. It should come as no surprise then that we went from the 20th Century Fox home video release on Laserdisc in 1982 to an identical release with different packaging in 1983 for CBS Fox. Really, the only difference between these two in the packaging is the tops there. Right, CBS Fox in the corner, 20th Century Fox. The 20th Century Fox one is much, much harder to find these days. Beyond the packaging, though, they are the same disc. Right, so same packaging except for the very top here. You flip it over, same packaging on the back except for the CBS Fox thing. Down here at the bottom, still time compressed, still one disc, CLV, an hour on each side, time compressed to fit. I suppose it's probably going without saying here, but these are, even though they are Laserdisc, and we think, ooh, it's a better format than VHS or Betamax or CED, they are still full screen. We're not near the widescreen era just yet when it comes to the film, so better picture, still full screen. Now, one thing that you don't see is something with the transition into 1984. Because you may recall that in 1984 on VHS, that was a big year because it was that new hi-fi stereo digitally mastered mix of the audio that restored C-3PO's missing line. And then you had an equivalent in Betamax. There wasn't an equivalent re-release on CED. Turns out, same was the case for Laserdisc. There is no 1984 version of A New Hope on Laserdisc. You either had the 20th Century Fox one from 82, or you had the CBS Fox one from 83 for A New Hope. That was it at the time. But also in 84, as we've seen previously, just as it took 5 years for A New Hope to come out on home video, it took 4 years, it's going to be 543, for The Empire Strikes Back to come out on home video. So of course in 84 we saw the first VHS release that we've looked at, the equivalent Betamax release that we looked at, the equivalent CED release that we've looked at. No surprise, along with it comes our new item here. The Empire Strikes Back's first release on Laserdisc. Once again, we're looking at a stereo extended play version, so a CLV disc, an hour on each side. Once again, time compressed. So if you look at the VHS, runtime, 124 minutes. You look at the Laserdisc, runtime, down there, 120 minutes. Okay? So an hour on either side, time compressed, so those 4 minutes get squished down in and don't become an issue as far as disk space. Keeps it on one disc with just 2 sides. The cover looks very familiar to us from all those other releases, or it should. Notice this also is the first of these releases with surround sound. Still analog, but surround sound instead of standard stereo. So it gets that type of boost, which helps because remember, 84 was the hi-fi audio versions on VHS and Betamax. So here we are with an equivalent to that, a better sound mix than what we would see with the original film on The Empire Strikes Back in this case. The back, pretty much the same. As far as it goes, the label, another one of those red and black type labels inside here. I'm not going to tend to show those very much because it tends to reflect the computer screen back at you, which is kind of disorienting, I think. But the first surround sound release here for the Star Wars films, and the first release of The Empire Strikes Back, with no corresponding re-release of A New Hope. One thing you might find interesting, by the way, is that price-wise, oddly enough, this is one of the cheaper ways to get it. It was better, though the players cost an arm and a leg, but the VHS releases around this time, particularly for the first A New Hope ones, you're looking at about $80 to buy one of those. On CED, you're looking at about $30 to $35, give or take. Betamax, I believe, very similar in price to the VHS, whereas these Laserdiscs tended to be about $30. The CLV format, keeping it on one disc with 2 sides, tended to be a relatively inexpensive way of producing these items, at least until the supply and demand issues out there in the market as VHS became much, much more popular, mainly because you could record things on it, drove demand for that up and the supply for that up with it, and wound up driving down the prices eventually of VHS production and VHS blank tapes and such. But at least initially, Laserdiscs were actually fairly affordable relative to some of these first home video releases on VHS. Where do we go from here? Well, the obvious is Return of the Jedi, right? Because we're covering through 1984 here. Return of the Jedi doesn't hit home video until 1986. But we also have some different versions of A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back coming our way in 1985. That'll be our next episode. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers. And then we had the Betamax version.